So that should be recording right now. Yeah. Oh yeah, works like a charm. So yeah, hello internet. My name is Danich Philip, and I'm just some random bloke, basically from the internet as well. And this will be a stream dedicated to basically learning React.js, hopefully helping you get started if you're new to this. If you're not new to this, then maybe we could turn this into like an intermediate kind of stream, explore some other concepts. So let me tell you a bit about what we'll be doing. This is, by the way, my Twitter account. Go there and follow me right now. Yeah, sure you will. So I set up a little repository here on GitHub, and I've actually initialized it with create React app. In my opinion, it's the best command line tool you can use to bootstrap a React project. You don't get anything too dense, too complicated to understand or follow with it. You just get a pure, uh, basically, environment where you can explore React, but you can also build production grade applications. Over at my company, we have several projects in production that have been bootstrapped with Create React App, and their default configuration is actually pretty good. And I don't think we've ever ejected from their configs. So that's very powerful. And out of the box, when you initialize a project, this is basically what you get. A little simple bootstrapped project that's, here you have a couple of files, some CSS, some basic JavaScript stuff. It's all good. So before we actually start coding, I want to talk about, the problem we're going to be solving today, I guess. We're going to be building a application that helps you keep track of turn, or rather initiative order in Dungeons and Dragons. So you probably heard of the game. It's like a role-playing tabletop game where you have one dungeon master basically, and several players who are playing the game. And combat is one of the key mechanics, key features of the game, and it's turn-based. And your turn is decided by a roll of a d20 die, and you add or subtract certain modifiers. Now the dungeon master, he has to do this for all the other like non-player characters as well. So what you end up with is having basically like, I don't know, let's say you have 5 players in the game, and then they have to fight against like 7 bandits, for example. That's a lot of combatants, and the dungeon master has to keep track of their initiative score, which means their turn order. And it can get a bit annoying if you're doing this on pen and paper, which is what some dungeon masters prefer. There are, of course, other apps that do this. I found them to be a bit sluggish, not very built for the modern web, not really dynamic or interactive as I would expect them to be. So what we're going to be doing today is trying to, well, at least starting out to build a app for Dungeons and Dragons that can do this, and we'll basically see that we branch out from there and build some more complex features. So what is this basically going to be? Well, we're going to build a list of cards. We're going to let the user add as many cards as they need, and each card should basically have just several properties in it that the user can edit. This is initiative, name, and hit points. And the list should order these cards based on the initiative score. So let me write some pseudocode real quick. This is what we basically want. We want to have each card have these. It's spelled initiative. I don't have to check that. No, it's spelled like this. Okay, we're learning new things. English, obviously not my native language. So, and what else did it say? Oh yeah, hit points. So this is like a simple data model that we'll be having for our cards. And obviously we want to have some master list component that keeps track of all of this. So that's the idea, right? Oh, hello, Jovan. Jovan is a colleague of mine from Spice Factory. He prefers it when I stream StarCraft. So this is new, I guess. So let's get started by clearing out all of this boilerplate junk. Probably should have done that a lot earlier, actually. I don't think we need any of this. That's fine. And we probably don't need the logo, is my guessing. So what we're gonna start with is making a simple component for our cards. And the thinking here is we want it to be what's called a pure component. We don't want a component that is managing any state. We just want it to display basically the props that it's being provided with, and we basically just wanted to communicate via callbacks with sort of this root component when it needs something to change. So when you enter like a new name for the character, we want that to be moved up. We want to move the state up prematurely. If you're new to React, you might not be comfortable doing that right away. It might be something that requires a bit of experience, but generally I don't think it's a very big deal. Something you'll see in motion very quickly. So for starters, let's just have basically our components have an input of type text, and on change we basically want to call our callback function. Okay, using some latest syntax here, that's fine. Pretty laggy as well. I guess it's because I'm also recording this. And we'll provide a simple onChange handler here that will log everything to the console. And if you're doing React development, the React extension here is very good at examining what's been output here. So you'll notice that the component, it doesn't have a name because it's basically anonymous at this point. That doesn't matter. What we have here is a simple input on the screen. That's our card. And when we start dispatching actions, they do get indeed logged to the console. So everything's working as expected, but we also want to control the value here from outside the component, right? So let's see how that would work. Say we have a function called update name. Okay. Just basically say this update name and provide the value as another prop. Cannot treat property value. That's my bad. And let's initialize value as something. Player 1, for example. And you can notice that Create React app has some really good error handling done for you. This is really laggy right now. Okay, there we go. Finally. So as we're typing, we're having a problem. Oh, yes, excellent. So we didn't bind the this context. So when it was calling this set state, it was executing it in a different context. So yeah, now we have it working. Basically, the results from this card are being stored in the state of our root component. Now, the problem with this right now is that we want to have a very large number of these cards on the screen, so we can't exactly do it like this. We will need to keep track of all our cards. So let's remove this for now. And think about how we want to organize our state here. Maybe we could do something like this. Keep a track of elements, where each element is basically a card. And it'll be an object that has some ID and a name. So we want to have like player 1, player 2. Okay, pretty simple stuff right now. And we want to first render all of those using our card component. So as you can see, we've done some thinking ahead, and we can use our card component right now. So for value, we want element.name, and we will need a key. React uses keys in this case to make the reconciliation process a lot easier. If you don't add the key, nothing major will happen, right away, but it can be a source of very painful bugs down the line. Now, we don't have an idea of how we're going to do the update name just yet, but maybe we can do something like this. We'll just call update name. We'll provide the ID as well. Sorry, it's not key, it's ID. And in our card component, we will also be providing the ID along with the onChange event. So what this basically means is that now we know what element we should be updating. Now, if this was a more interesting language or a different library, we could easily do an update here in place. But the way we've set things up right now with this array is that we will likely need to find the index of the element that we're changing first. So, and we'll come back to that. We'll write this code in a more elegant matter later. But for now, let's just find the index of the element that we're changing. And what we're looking for is an element whose ID matches the ID that we just received. And set that. This function right here is far from being the most beautiful piece of code that we will be writing. Oh, we have a mistake on line 25. Thank you, React. But we'll come back to that later, especially as we plan to at some point introduce Redux and immutable JS, which will make our state management concerns a lot easier. But right now, we don't have that much to worry about. And if we see things here, we can see that all the logic that we've basically implemented so far is working, which is terrific news. Now we can get to basically implementing things a lot faster. So at this point, it might be a good idea to style these a bit. Honestly, they're not the prettiest thing in the world, and I'm no designer, so they're still not going to be the prettiest thing in the world, but they might at least look like something. Let me take a sip of water. So I don't know, let's give them some big width, maybe some padding all around. Might want to give them like a box shadow kind of thing. That looks a lot better. Maybe style the input a bit as well. So something like that, maybe. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Maybe get rid of all the borders except so now it looks like something that you know you can edit in place, but don't really have to bother with it. Maybe some margin bottom, for example, to yeah, that looks a lot better already. Let's just see what we can do with the body here. Maybe give it a width of 700 pixels and sort of force everything to center. Something like that. At least now it's easier to get a good glimpse of what's happening on the screen. Some red wine as well. Fresh off the holidays, still have some wine left. So let's look at what's up. What should we be doing next? Well, for good measure, let's add some more cards on by default. And let's start introducing this concept of basically initiative. We want remember, we want give the user the ability to basically tweak this number that's called initiative, and we want this list to be sorted according to that number, with the highest initiative being, closer to the top. So, and because I know I'm going to misspell this again, let it be something like that. So now this concept of value isn't exactly correct. We have different values that we will be using throughout this component. Now the funny thing about this is that update initiative is going to look a lot like update name. In fact, the only difference between these two is that we will need to basically set this value into like a number. We'll want to cast it to keep it like a number. So there's really no major difference between these two functions. They take in an ID and some event from some proxy event from React that has the value of the input element, and they set it to the corresponding element inside the state. So this is a very good target for some refactoring, which we will be looking at later, especially once we introduce immutable JS to the whole thing. Actually, we might take a look at it before we introduce immutable JS, so we can sort of have several examples of a good refactor. So now we have like a lot of new props in this component. This is no longer value, this is name. This is on name change. And we want to add another input here. I'll type number. Value will be initiative. And we will be calling on initiative change. Let's see if that will work on a blind test. Yeah, looks like it will. Oh no, we didn't change the proper thing. This is how you make mistakes when you just blindly copy paste code and say, well, I'll update that later. Luckily in this case we have a small project, so it's very easy to catch mistakes as they happen. But potentially in the future that will be a more difficult process for you, especially as you have a lot of moving parts. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So we have our inputs right now. So what we want to do next is have this entire list sort according to the initiative number. So there are a couple of places where we could do this. We could sort this list every time a change happens. So here in the update initiative function, we could resort basically this entire array. We could also not do that and instead just sort it here before we map it out into the interface. Potentially, we might want to do it here because there's no need to potentially sort everything every time the component renders. It means that you would be repeating the sorting function even when someone is changing the name, even though the name doesn't impact the sort itself. So maybe we should do something else instead. Maybe we should be sorting it here. So let's try that. Let's sort it by initiative. So now when I change this, yeah, so actually the other way around, I'm sorry. We want the highest value to be up. But we have a bit of a problem because as I'm doing this, you know, things are changing. My React is keeping the focus properly, but everything is being updated unnecessarily, might I add. The resource should probably be happening only when I decide to stop typing, for example. So what can we do here to make that basically easier for our user to minimize this bouncing effect, to have everything basically reorder itself only once the user has finished typing? So that basically means our next problem is deferring this this reordering. And a good way to sort of achieve that is using something I believe it's called debounce. I'm never sure on the terminology. Basically what we want to say is wait a bit, and if the user doesn't type anything, then do the sort. Right? So here we're just going to be sorting the elements, and we'll make a new function. Let's call it sort elements. And by the way, you can notice that the number of functions here is already piling up a lot. A lot of proponents of React will tell you that you don't need Redux, you don't need this, you can use set state for everything, and as long as you write clean code, it's basically the same, and go for Redux when you're ready for it. That is correct, but in my opinion, you probably don't know, if you're new to this, you probably aren't sure about writing clean code right off the bat. So what you're doing is you're writing like some spaghetti code, or maybe this is lasagna code, I don't know, where you have this big master component that it's initializing the default state, it's defining your updaters, it's defining the sorts, it's defining how you want to present your elements. And you can write all of this in a much cleaner and easier way by extracting all of this logic somewhere else and then just including it where needed. And yes, you can do that, but the way that set state basically works, and along with some of JavaScript's basic limitations, you're forced to have code that is not very pretty. But that's fine. We're just getting started here. We're building a hobby project, so we don't have to worry about those things, I think. All that we're going to be doing now is building something that solves a problem, and we're not gonna geek out about it. That's what I want us to accomplish today. So we've extracted the sort logic here into a method called sortElements, and we're going to be calling that function, that method, when there is no longer a need to wait on the user for input. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to be setting a timeout. Which will be a function that calls this sortElements 50 milliseconds after the user has stopped typing. But whenever this function is called, it will clear that timeout. So what happens is, if I type something, it will do all of this and set a timeout to execute in 500 milliseconds. If I don't type anything within those 500 milliseconds, this will be called and it will reshuffle the entire list. But if I do type something within that interval, the timeout will be cleared and will basically be deferring the sorting for another 500 milliseconds. So let's see if that works. So you can see that the list isn't jumping around. But something isn't working right. Excellent, we get to do some debugging then. Oh, we didn't actually call the function. So there. So after a moment, we see the shuffle happen. It takes a while, and then it gets resorted. So this doesn't necessarily look very pretty, but it's pretty enough for now. We don't have the problem from previously where the cards were just jumping up and down, going all over the place. It looks a lot better. So our next step is to also include the hit points that our characters have, and we want to let our user basically add and remove cards as they like. So let's really quickly add the hit points. It's just going to be another input field basically, also of type number. We can call it hit points. Hit points change. Obviously we want to add that here. So one thing you should add to your project. We use it ourselves, the Spice Factory, is Prettier. It's basically a very useful tool that formats code for you. So you don't have to do what I just did here, which is format this code by hand into something more readable, because we had a very long line on line 3 with all of these arguments. Not ideal. But yeah, Prettier does that automatically for you every time you either save a file or every time you commit something to Git. Yeah, I'm adding some default like hit points here. I don't know. Maybe something like this. I wonder how random our human random generation is. Okay. And we'll need another method here. Update hit points. So you can see the methods piling up, but like I said, they're pretty trivial in this case. Also want to bind the context here because we're also doing like set state and stuff. And finally, we can just pass it all down here. Wait, why is it called onHit point change? Should it be called update hit points? Microsoft Visual Studio Code not always best with its autocomplete suggestions. I honestly started using WebStorm last month, and I prefer it a lot to Visual Studio Code. But I don't know, I think the theme that I have going on here is a lot prettier for you guys to watch. So that was the idea behind that. Now we have a lot of these inputs going. We might want to add labels so that we know what the hell we're even looking at. Since I'm going to misspell this again, I'm just going to copy it. And by the way, guys, I'm checking the chat periodically, so if you have any questions, feel free to post them. Maybe you want me to talk about something different. That's also fine with me. Again, use Prettier. It makes life easier for you. No idea why the text is so huge compared to what's in the input, but maybe we can fix that. Something like that, maybe. Yeah, that looks a lot better, honestly. Let's see if this works. Ah, the same mistake has been made again. Update hit points. I wonder if any one of you actually caught that before it happened. Yes, we've started with create React app. The ultimate goal for today's session is to basically have an application that solves a simple problem when playing Dungeons and Dragons, and that's keeping track of turn order. So what we're hoping to accomplish basically is very close to what from where we are now, and that is the ability for this to basically be a sortable list where we can add and remove elements. At some point we probably want to style this so it's much prettier, and then we can get to what I think is the fun part, probably for a lot of you, and that's optimizing the code. Well, not optimizing it, there are no performance problems here, but making it prettier, making it easier to read, easier to maintain, easier to test uh, at some point, but I don't think that's what we're going to be doing in this session, and that's adding Redux and immutable JS. I think that's very powerful because we're basically going to see how we can take our current state right now and just throw it out from our component without really losing a lot of time. So that's basically, I think, the answer to the questions you guys posted. If you have any other questions, please feel free to shoot. The stream is perhaps a bit laggy, so sorry about that. Yeah. So our next goal here is to allow our user to add new cards and to allow them to remove cards that basically are no longer required. Or if they've added too many of these cards, for example. Another thing I'm thinking is maybe restyle this card. It's really big right now. You could maybe use something like flexbox for that. So for example, I gotta say I'm not very good at this, but maybe if we go like this, is it flex direction? Yeah, I think that looks a lot easier to manage. It takes a lot of less space, and it wasn't a difficult thing to accomplish. So let's start adding like a button that will add new things to the new cards to the list, basically. I think just add is enough. And on click, we want to call a method that will be called this, add card. I think that's fine for now. So what we basically want to do is, get our list of elements and to the end of our element array add basically like new item. Now there's something to be said about ID generation. We will probably want to have that randomized, but for now, let's just put it like this, for example. And you'll see some problems popping up with our logic right away as I click on add. Right, we didn't bind the context. So when it was calling this, it had no idea what this you were referring to, or rather, it was not referring to the same this as the one you were hoping. Right, so this is adding exactly what we need. Okay, excellent. But it does have a couple of problems. For example, it's not resorting the list. And it's a good, usability question to consider is, do we want this to basically be resorted every time? Or do we want to intentionally add the new item to the bottom of the list? If so, it would be a good idea to always add like -100 or something to basically let the user know that they should be updating this new card that was added. Right? And it doesn't look like a bug. It looks fine. That's one way we could go around doing it. Another way we could go around this is randomizing everything and just resorting the entire thing. The problem with randomizing it is that you never know where the new item will be. So I think that from a usability standpoint, we want this to always have like a negative initiative value, which sort of lets you know, hey dude, the card you just added is at the bottom and it will always be there. Another problem we have is how we're generating these IDs. So I'm basically using the index of that element in the array to generate the ID. But as we add the option to remove these elements, we will start having duplicate IDs potentially. So for example, you remove some element and then you add one, and now you have two elements with the same ID. That's a major concern for us. It's the source of a potentially very big bug. So let's start randomizing these IDs. And we could probably get away with just using math random. So let's create a function that will basically just call math random and multiply that by a big number. There's still a chance that we would get a collision with this, but it's very improbable mathematically, and you're not going to have more than like 20 of these cards at one moment. So that potentially solves our problem with the IDs themselves. All right. So the next thing we're going to hopefully attempt to accomplish is to have the ability for each card to be removed from this list. Obviously, we're doing that based on the ID of the card itself. So what we want to do in our card component, which is, you'll notice, getting a lot bigger. And all of these inputs are basically the same. So let's start slowly improving the quality of our code here. Let's create an input component. I'll copy a lot of this. And what our input component is going to return is basically a label containing an input. And it will have the following properties: label, type, value on change. So that's label type value on change. At some point, if you're new to this, you will probably be creating component libraries for your project. This is how that will go down. You'll be creating inputs and buttons and everything so that you can just reuse your code across the project. So now if we go to our card component, we can import input and basically make this code a lot easier is the idea. So what do we have? We have a label called name, a type text, and this is our onChange handler, right? I think that's a lot easier to read. Potentially it can even stand on one line. And you could technically even create an array that has all of these values and then just map over that the same way we're doing with the elements here. But I don't think there's a need for that just yet. This is a pretty... Am I using... No, I'm already putting the 2 dots there, so no need for that. So this is a number. This is the handler. So not a very exciting refactor just yet, but it is making our code a lot easier to look at, to scan. At some point when you use too much HTML inside of a React component, it becomes a nightmare to read, is my personal experience at least. Another thing to consider is accessibility. Let's see how accessible this component is if you're just using a keyboard, basically. So, oh, we didn't add the value. Silly me. So the value is name, initiative, and hit points. Let's check on Twitch really fast. Don't you have to cast the random ID to an integer? That's an excellent point. When we do the multiplication here, it's not going to be an integer. So we could use matfloor for that. Very good notice there. Although it wouldn't have caused us much trouble right at the start, but it could have been a cause of a problem later on. Do you have a steady screening schedule? Oh man, I don't really, but if you click the follow button or if you follow me on Twitter, at some point I do plan on, there's the link right there. At some point I do plan on establishing a consistent schedule. Might even stream some work I do at the office as well. We'll see about that. But generally, I'll be posting any information relating to that on Twitter or maybe here on Twitch. Generally, really new to this. This is the first stream I'm doing, so that's fun. So everything seems to be working properly at the moment. Excellent. So the next step in all of this is to add basically a delete button to remove all of these, to add the ability to remove these cards. But before we do that, let's try extracting things away from this gigantic component that's basically becoming very hard to read. So I create a utilities like file. I'm going to start by moving this here and exporting it. Right. This elements array is really bugging me out, so maybe a new file called constants. And let's export it. Let's call it initial state. Now the problem here is that we are technically using the function called random ID, so we need to import it as well. But outside of that, we should be good here. And obviously the file and folder structure right now isn't particularly beautiful, but it's not horrible by any means. The scope of the problem is very small for us to worry about it right now. So just to check that everything still works. Should really add some automated test for that at some point. Yeah, so that's pretty good already. We will be refactoring this at some point as well. Don't need to worry about this anymore, about this. So let's add like a little button, I suppose. Now I want this button to also be flex button. But I probably don't want it to take the same amount of space as everything else. Not sure if this works. Yeah, it works, but it's still how about that? Yeah, I mean, it's ugly as hell, but it's kind of what I want it to be. Not sure why there isn't a pointer here. I'm missing something? No, there it is. Okay. Any questions from the chat? No, not really, but we're up to 21 viewers already. Wow, that's impressive. I was expecting like 0 people at this point. So I'm very curious why you guys are watching the stream. Are you just having like some, downtime and you want to watch some programming? Are you hoping to learn React? Are you new to React? Are you like, would you describe yourselves as intermediates, just starting out? Is programming your profession? Are you studying it? Let me know anything like that in the comments. So what we want to do now is code that remove function. It's basically the last feature that we plan on implementing today, and then we can focus on clearing this mess a bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a method called remove element. It's going to accept the ID of the element that's supposed to be removed, And very similarly to what we're doing in the other methods, we're going to start out by getting the elements array from our local component state, and we're going to be looking for the index and basically removing it. Now this is a JavaScript syntax I'm not always familiar with. You could technically use something like slice to achieve this, but you could also be greedy and do something like just elements filter and filter out the element that has the same ID as the one you just received, and then just set it. Right. Since we're not dealing with a very large list of elements, there's no reason to worry about any performance implications of anything that's in this component just yet. So on remove is a new property here, and basically we're going to be calling okay, so elements is read only. Oh, that's right, because we defined it as a constant. So when you define something as a constant, obviously you cannot reassign the value. Although with JavaScript's arrays, you can reassign the value of elements. So for example, elements, this is valid, even though it's a constant. But reassigning the whole thing, the entire reference, that's a no-go. So let's just use let. We could have also declared a new constant. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so some responses from the chat. I'm intermediate. The primary thing I have to learn is how to structure. Okay, awesome. So that's not really the focus of the stream, but at some point I do aim to aim these sessions towards more complex topics where you have a system with a lot of moving parts. Why people prefer the bind this instead of using arrow function? Excellent question. I think for me at least, it's just habit. There was also a point at which the people at work were encouraging me to do something like this. So this function equals, but then that was considered harmful because it's not an official spec. At some point in the future, you might have to go through the code and edit it, even though realistically you would use an automated tool to do that for you. I guess it's just habit, and it's one of those things that isn't that important to the quality of the code overall. Or if it is, it's something that your team will define at the start of the project and you'll just stick with it. So it's not really up to your opinion or anything. And I mentioned previously at some point that you should really be using Prettier in all of your projects. I mean, JavaScript projects, obviously, because it's really gets rid of all these unnecessary discussion about code styles and how you should be writing this, when you should be breaking things on a new line, whatever. Personally, with Prettier and linter and a good linter, At some point, I guess it doesn't really matter. There's another interesting question. Oh, Dan Abramov retweeted me. Huh. That's really cool. He's a really cool guy. I unfortunately never got a chance to meet him. Whenever I'm at some conference where I expect he would be there, he never really is. So that's really a shame. But yeah, he's a really good guy, really active in the community, supporting everyone, basically from beginners to intermediates to people, even people who are reinventing React in certain ways. But, let's try and get back to the problem, I guess, at some point. So we were using bind to do this remove element stuff. I think at this point it's going to work. Sorry guys. We're keeping everything, not... That's a funny problem to create. Right, so, and because our list is always basically sorted, it doesn't matter. We don't have to resort everything. Removing the element is technically keeping the sort stable. So really no need to bother with resorting it at all. That's really good. This does complete the basic feature set I was hoping to do in this stream. It wasn't meant to be a very long stream, but since we have like a lot of people here, well, a lot compared to what I was expecting, I get to talk with you guys and interact with you. So I have a question for you. Do you have these, something like these, wherever you're from? They call them honey hearts. It's basically like a cookie with something that's supposed to be honey inside, but it's really just some sugary stuff. I don't know, but I like it. They're really popular here in Serbia. I'm wondering if they're popular elsewhere in the world, basically. Yeah, jazz. If I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I think you're right on that, but again, I think it's a very small thing in the grand scheme of things. With so much stuff you should be worrying about, it's one of those things you just agree on at the start of the project and go with it, I suppose. My opinion, at least. Everyone has an opinion on everything, realistically, but we're just hoping that there's enough people who agree with us. All right, so you do have these in Germany. Interesting. I'm guessing it's kind of a European thing, maybe. So I missed a comment earlier. Gingerbread around Christmas time. No, this isn't like gingerbread, but I'm guessing you're referring to the honey inside of it. Yeah, I don't know. So I'm curious, how do I tag people here? Modelime? I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, I'm sorry. So where are you studying this full stack course? Are you using some specific website, service, or are you just doing it on your own? And if so, what kind of resources do you use for that? I've often talked to people that I have no idea how I would teach someone to develop. It's a very difficult question. What do you tell people who want to become developers? Where should they start? So I'm fascinated to hear about experiences like that. All right, so another cool thing we could add here is a button that basically rolls a random D20 die and applies that value to the initiative. I think that would be really cool because then, as a dungeon master, you wouldn't have to roll a die and enter the number every time. You could just click on a button on the interface. So that would potentially save the user some time. So that would be adding another button, I suppose. And now this is where I think things get a bit interesting. Because we can say, on click, call this handler that we have defined called onInitiative change with this ID. But here we would be calling it with some number that was randomly generated. But that's not how our method was initially designed. It's designed to accept an event, React proxy event that's basically similar to the one you receive from the browser, and it's extracting the value from a target. So what we could do here is, we could be cheeky, I guess, and go with returning an object that has the same structure as that, right? Or we could provide a different method. I don't think that's really necessary. Or we could provide a third argument that basically or we could check if the value is already a number. That's also another concept we could use. Start with structure and interpretation of computer programs. Is that the answer to my previous question about advice you should give to beginners? I'm not sure what that's referring to. I guess that's the answer to my question about how you should get people into development or engineering or whatever. That's an interesting point. So in any case, what we want to do is write a new utility function. Let's be cool and call it roll a d20. So there's something to be said, like I mentioned earlier, about JavaScript's math random. It's not that random as people have discovered, a long time ago. I think there's a major bias towards the numbers 4, 5, and 6 or something. But, again, I think that for the purposes of this coding session, it's a book, actually. So, Structure and Interpretation of Programs. It's a pretty dense book. Well, it does sound pretty dense. Yeah, I have to check this book out. I don't know how, but I've never actually heard of this book, and I try to actually uh, keep in touch with what people consider to be classics that you should be reading, like The Art of Clean Code and Programming Pearls and Coders at Work and stuff like that. Yeah, this. Wait, is this like a free book? It's an MIT Press, yeah. So what did it have? Building abstractions with procedures, abstractions with data, modularity, object, and state. Yeah, this looks like a book that has like a lot of information, but this doesn't seem like a book I would recommend to anyone who hasn't had like at least 6 months of experience of writing code and building at least some simple applications or something. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not that difficult to follow along. It's an easier introduction. Right? Yeah, so this is something that I'm definitely bookmarking. Very interesting. Is there like any stream where someone reads a programming book and then digests it for his viewers? That sounds like an interesting concept. I think I'd watch that. You basically get to have someone read a book for you as well as digest complicated concepts that you might not understand. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Any other book recommendations you guys have? Or girls, sorry. Yeah, you folks have? Um, things that you maybe have read that have given you a different outlook on programming or programming as a craft, perhaps. Um, can't really remember, but I think that programming pearls had a lot of impact on me as an engineer. It had some really interesting uh, problems to think about and solutions that seem like something you should have come up with on your own. Yet they were surprisingly elegant and well designed. Other than that, I think Introduction to Functional Programming was like a book I wish I had read 3 years ago. It's a book from O'Reilly. Yeah, I think there's a lot of books that have that name. So the one I'm referring to. Oh man, it's none of these. Huh. Okay, I'm stumped. I don't actually remember the name of the book then. Maybe if I just say functional programming O'Reilly. Come on. Really? Okay, I give up. It's hard to pin down any one particular book on programming. Yes, I agree. But about development process, the Phoenix project completely changed your view. Oh, really? How so? I've not really uh, kept track of Phoenix or in general that part of the development community. Uh, is there any way you could like digest in one comment what is it about the Phoenix project that has changed your outlook on things? I understand it's a very difficult question, and this is maybe not a format for that, but you know, any little tidbit of advice is always good. Becoming functional. No, it's not that one. Ah, here it is. Functional thinking paradigms. Paradigm over syntax. Yes, I think it was this one. So it's not a book that I would recommend to anyone who has done a significant amount of functional programming already. And the format is very confusing because he examines like problems that you would solve using procedural or object-oriented programming in Java. And then he solves them using Scala or Groovy, or maybe just some functional abilities that the new versions of Java have. But if it were a book that I received while I was still in college, where we had not had any chance to basically meet with functional programming during the classes and whatever, this would have been, you know, the kind of book I would have loved at that point, because it would have taken all these things I knew, or at least thought I knew, and explored them in different ways and showed how the power of abstraction, I suppose, the ability to view your language as just another abstraction that you use to command over the machine, and not worrying too much. Because, right, if you guys have been through like a formal education process, you know, this is my experience, but you do a lot of C programming, for example. Uh, and C is awesome. And C is a very good way to learn about operating systems and to slowly get a better understanding of the hardware below. But the amount of stuff you need to worry about with C is so overwhelming. Yeah, like Java was amazing when I first saw it compared to how much of a struggle it was to write stuff in C. And I'm talking about like complex stuff, you know, or whatever it is complex for someone who is like still a student. All right, guys, thank you all for joining me today. Uh, this was like a pilot stream or whatever. Uh, I was not expecting people to actually like jump in and interact, and this was really fun for me at least. I hope you guys also enjoyed it. I will be posting a video of this stream on here on Twitch and on YouTube or whatever. Um, it might take a few hours for the video to be processed. Okay, one more comment first. I'll try. It's a story about a dysfunctional technology company and how it steered into becoming a high-performing technology company. Okay, sounds good. It goes over many topics. It gives examples of anti-patterns in terms of life cycle and organizational structure, how to address them. One of the many things they took away. Yeah, so uh, agile. that's uh, that's an interesting word. We might be doing a special stream dedicated to agile, as in, you know, the stuff I think 90% of engineers hate, versus what's really the point of everything, and that's continuous delivery and uh, reacting quickly to feedback from customers and whatever. Uh, Again, not something I'd go into, but yeah, that's a great segue for some future session, I suppose. So yeah, like I said, I'll be posting this on YouTube and here on Twitch. Uh, if you want, you can follow me, here on Twitch. Click the follow button. Uh, you can follow me on Twitter, I suppose. Here, let me write that down. The bad parts of Agile. Oh, you like? Aha, sorry. As a first-time developer in Agile environment, I really like it. Uh, Again, like going off topic. Uh, like I said, it will be a good session, sometime in the future, like next week maybe. But in general, it really depends on the team, the size of the team, who is like the agile evangelist in the company, and how they're going about doing it. Uh, in some companies, there's really no agile. They're just calling it that because they're using like Trello or Jira and Kanban boards and stand-up meetings, but actually they're letting people be self-organized and uh, having management that focuses on what's important. And in those types of environments, it's what you would call a good implementation of Agile. Everyone feels productive, everyone feels happy, and the customer gets what they need. Important note, what they need, not what they initially said they wanted, I suppose. But in some other companies, especially in larger enterprises, where if you're really good at selling something, you can sell an entire methodology like Agile very good. And what happens in potentially is in those environments is a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of uh, sticking to the rules when you shouldn't really be, I suppose, doing things that make no sense. At some point, it becomes like a contradiction. By trying to be agile, you have a team that's not agile at all. In my experience as well, if you are in an agile environment, I suppose in a smaller team, like we're talking companies that have between 20 and 60 people, with engineering teams around 4 to 10 people, uh, that's a good environment. Um, the basic principles of agile, everything kind of clicks and makes sense. But at the other end of the spectrum, and I have a lot of friends in these large enterprise like companies, agile becomes a chore, is the idea. And maybe I can get them as guests on the stream, and that would be interesting for them to like share that experience firsthand instead of me like rephrasing our conversations from earlier. So yeah, that's basically it. Thank you all for watching. Uh, I hope we will like have an opportunity to have more streams like this where we can have fun coding and interacting with each other. Okay, sure. One more question. uh, yeah, I'm glad you feel the same. A complex open source project built with React where one can look at the code and learn from it. Not sure about the learn from it part. I think you can learn something from every piece of code. Uh, the general consensus is, are you experienced enough to know what you're learning from it? So, yeah, I'm not in that big of a hurry, so I'll answer the question. Um, I think a lot of stuff by Formidable Labs might be solid for learning some code. Is this how they're spelled? They have a lot of like projects, I suppose, on GitHub. I would look at some of their code maybe because it's there's a lot of popular stuff in there with a lot of contributors, a lot of people who understand some of the ins and outs of React. So I would expect that their code is of solid quality. Uh, Another thing that might be interesting to look at, I remember looking at it before. Uh, React Grid, I think, is the name of the. No, React Table, perhaps. Yes, this package. Uh, it it's a component that solves a very large set of problems. So once you understand all the problems that the component is solving, it becomes interesting to see how they've solved all the problems that they were looking to solve. Namely, this idea of having a presentational data grid, which can also be used for like CRUD stuff, but also have asynchronous operations and asynchronous sorting and whatever. I think that stuff is interesting to look at. All right, guys. Thank you for tuning in and see you sometime in the future. Bye.